Hello, I'm Leonard Maltin, and I have seen the future. It's inside this man's head. This is Ray Bradbury, the preeminent novelist, poet, thinker, futurist, and science fiction eminence. And it's a great pleasure to talk to you about a subject we both care about, Walt Disney.
Thank you, thank you.
Thanks for talking to us, Ray.
Pleasure, great to be here.
When did you meet Walt Disney?
It was a wonderful thing. I was Christmas shopping one day about 40 odd years ago. I was in a department store and I saw a man coming across the store with a huge load of presents in his hands and his head tucked over the top. And I looked at his face, I said, my God, that's Walt Disney, my hero. I admired him since I was 8 years old. So I ran over to him and I said, Mr. Disney? He said, yes. He said, my name is Ray Bradbury. He says, I know your books. I said, oh, thank God. He says, why thank God? I said, because someday in the near future, I want to take you to lunch. And then he said, tomorrow? How about that? When's the last time someone said tomorrow to you? So the next day, I was in his office, had a card table, soup and sandwiches, and we babbled like a couple of kids.
What surprised you most about him as you got to know him a little bit?
What surprised me was how ordinary he was. In other words, there's nothing flamboyant there. It was like having lunch with my papa. But the great thing was that he knew that I listened and he knew that I cared. And he would go out of his way then to entertain me. I went for lunch one day over the years, and on the way in, his secretary said, you have 1 hour at 1 o'clock out. He's got a busy schedule. I said, okay. So we sat at lunch and we babbled like always about everything. And at 1 o'clock, I jumped up. I said, thanks, Walt. I got to go. He said, wait a minute, I got something to show you. So he took me out on the lot. He showed me the new hippopotamus. They're working on a new Lincoln robot. He had to show me that. And the people mover. We came back to the office at 3 o'clock, 2 hours late. And the secretary looked daggers at me. And I said, no, him, you know. So that's an example. And enthusiasm was Walt Disney's middle name.
Absolutely. You could tell that from afar, and I'm glad that it translated to your meetings with him as well. Is the story apocryphal or true that you asked him about running for mayor?
We've had some bad mayors in L.A. with rapid transit and all the problems. And one day at lunch I said, Walt, I really think you should run for mayor. He said, Ray, why should I run for mayor when I'm already king? Which I think is very good, very good.
Very good indeed. One aspect of Walt's personality and mindset and worldview was that he really was a forward-thinking man. And in many ways, I think he was a futurist. Would you agree with that assessment?
He was ahead of everyone in the whole world, as far as I'm concerned. The things he did as a cartoonist, an animator during the 20s and 30s, putting his reputation, his name, his money on the line. People told him that he couldn't make sound cartoons. He made them. They said, you can't make Snow White, it won't work. He put all of his money in that, got loans on his studio, put that out, very successful. Fantasia took a huge chance. It was years ahead of its time. It still is, still is. He gambled on that and for a little while lost because the film didn't make that much money. But then about 6 years later, it started going out in the world and people realized what he had done. So with Disneyland, with his work at the World's Fair in New York in 1964-65, proved that he was ahead of everyone, always.
And he led his colleagues, of course, and his staff in the same direction. And they often didn't know where he was leading them, but they caught on fast. And he seemed to be a great orchestrator of talent that way.
He had the sense, I think he was in a toy shop in London, and he saw one of these animators, future animators, buying a toy train. And as a result of seeing him buy a toy train, and Walt had a number of them at home, this fellow became an employee. So that's the way he chose. All of the people that Disney employed were gentle people, and he had the knack for picking them.
I want to ask you about some of the specific projects that he worked on, but before I want to sort of set the stage a little. For people who are too young to have experienced it and need to know a little about this, why did science fiction flourish as it did in the decade of the 1950s?
Science fiction started to come alive as a result of the impact of the various technologies. Radio during the 20s and 30s, then the invention of television started in 1929 but came to birth in 1945-46. So that by 1950 you had all this amassing of technologies and people's interest in what cars were doing to us, telephones were doing to us, and what TV was doing to us, plus the atom bomb. So with the impact of all these technologies, it was only natural that eventually someone would say, why don't we begin to do films about this? Why don't we do books about this? And I was lucky to be born at just the right time and came to fruition when I was 30 in 1950, and I've benefited from this.
What year was The Martian Chronicles first published?
1950.
1950. And then how many years later was Fahrenheit 451?
3 years later.
You were right in the midst of all of this.
Yes, indeed.
Well, in 1954, when Walt Disney put his Disneyland TV show on the air, and while he was building Disneyland, the park, one key element was Tomorrowland. And I wonder if there would have been a Tomorrowland as effective at any other time as it was right at that moment in the 50s. He too was in the midst of that decade of thought and imagination and worry and fear and projections about the future.
He reminds me of that fabulous story of the man who jumped on his horse and rode off in all directions. In other words, there were 4 parts to Walt, as there were 4 parts to Disneyland. So he knew enough to pay attention to the past, he knew enough to pay attention to the present, and then he had the foresight to talk about the future. I was very protective of him and Disneyland. I went there the first time with Charles Laughton, the great English actor. And he took me around Disneyland, and he became Captain Bligh when we got on the Jungle Boat. And he keel-hauled people all the way around the ride and plowed through the crowds and took me on the Peter Pan ride over Big Ben at midnight. So when intellectual critics from New York criticized Disneyland, I wrote a letter to the nation saying, if it's good enough for Charles Laughton, it's good enough for me. Let me give you another story. I came back from Paris one time about 10 years ago, went to Disneyland, and I looked on the side of Sleeping Beauty's castle, and I called John Hench over at Imagineering. I said, I just noticed something about Sleeping Beauty's castle. There's a spire there that I saw last on top of Notre Dame and the Palais de Justice in Paris. I said, how long has that been there on Sleeping Beauty's castle? He said, 20 years. I said, who put it there? He said, Walt did. I said, why? Because he loved it. I said, that's why I love Walt Disney. It cost $100,000 to build a spire you didn't need. The secret of Disney is doing things you don't need and doing them well, and then you realize you needed them all along.
Everything contributes. Everything adds to the whole. I've been watching the Disneyland TV shows, the Tomorrowland shows that were done in the first season when Ward Kimball did a series of shows about space travel. And they called on people like Willy Ley and Werner von Braun and Heinz Haber to project into the future, the near future, as it turned out. But what occurred to me in all of this was that so many people who look into the future see only bleakness, see only the worst that humanity will suffer from the changes and the upheavals. Walt was an optimistic futurist, and that's rare. Could you comment on that?
If there's any secret at all, it's because Walt, like myself, is not an optimist, but an optimal behaviorist, which means that every day of your life, if you behave well, you begin to feel well, huh? So that's not false, that's real. You get your work done every day, and at the end of a week, a month, a year, you turn around and say, hey, look what I did. So you feel good. That's real optimism, optimal behavior. So that's, I think, the way he behaved. Mm-hmm. And he could look back at the end of each year and see his behavior, and it made him want to go on. A lot of people are pessimists because they've never done anything. If you go to bed every night having not done anything, you're going to wake up unhappy, aren't you? So the answer to that is do something every day. Huh? Be busy, for God's sake. Be busy.
Well, he certainly subscribed to that.
Yep.
When he put those shows on the air about space travel, and also a famous show called Our Friend the Atom, which Heinz Haber had a lot to do with, he was really doing two things. He was educating America, but he was also kind of propagandizing or proselytizing, I don't know which would be the right word, for America's involvement in a space program. And that show was so popular, and he carried so much clout that he earned with the American public.
Yes.
I think the impact must have been tremendous.
Oh, absolutely. I remember at the time seeing those shows, and they were completely alone. There was no one else in the field, no one else that cared. And finally, Kennedy came along a few years later, and we promised ourselves to the moon.
I wonder if those shows had never been broadcast, if public sentiment would have been as enthusiastic, would have gone along with the idea quite as easily.
Indeed, it did help very much, yes.
In fact, Disney used the term science factual because all of those shows were based on fact and based on the experience of these renowned scientists. How would you delineate the difference between science fiction and science factualism, if there's such a word?
They're begging the question. The history of mankind is all science fiction. It starts on the walls of the caves in the south of France. You go and look at the walls of the cave, and they're covered with science fiction pictographs, pictures of men solving problems. How do you kill a wild boar? How do you kill an elephant? How do you kill a wildcat? So you have to dream killing in order to kill. You have to invent bows and arrows. You have to invent spears, because a spear is an extension of your hand. A bow and arrow, all these things are extensions of the mind. So you dream a thing first. That's science fiction, primitive science fiction. Then you build it, and it's science fact. But the science fact comes after. You can't claim a thing as science fact. You have to do the dreaming first.
When did you first have occasion to work for and with the Disney Company?
I wrote an essay about Herman Melville and Jules Verne as being great representatives of the American will, the American blasphemy. Jules Verne was our French uncle, but part of the American blasphemy of opposing nature on the proper grounds. Ahab went too far, saying he would strike the sun if it insulted him, and Nemo came along and said, don't strike the sun, plug into it with the scientific method and light the seas of the world. When I wrote this essay, people in charge of the United States Pavilion at the New York World's Fair read it and came to my house here and said, "We've come to give you a $50 million building." I said, come in. And I said, "What's this all about?" They said, "We're building the United States Pavilion, and we think you can do a history of the United States, starting with Columbus and ending with space travel." So because of that essay, I took over. The Disney people saw, long way around to the point here, the Disney people saw what I'd seen, what I'd done, and they came to me and said, "We have a $50 million building, too. Will you help us stuff it with metaphors?" So I worked with John Hench and helped create Spaceship Earth down at Epcot.
Now, Epcot is another great, of course, manifestation of Walt's interest in the future and what the future could mean to all of us, to the average person, in changing what we see as our everyday life.
When I was a kid, I went to see the Chicago World's Fair, the Century of Progress. I was madly in love with it. I became an architect in my mind. I didn't want to go home at night. It was so beautiful. My parents had to drag me out. Then I discovered 2 years later that the damn fools are going to tear it down. And I thought, how stupid to tear down a dream when we need it, huh? And all the world's fairs, except in the case of the French, they were smart and kept up a lot of their buildings from 100 years ago, the Eiffel Tower and the Palais, the Grand Palais, and what have you. So I always thought when I was a child that someone should build a permanent World's Fair and improve our minds and educate us to dreams constantly, day after day, for a lifetime. And that's what Disney did. They built Epcot. It's a permanent World's Fair. It sheds its skin on occasion. They put in new exhibits. So they refresh the whole process. And if that doesn't represent Walt Disney, nothing does.
Now, he had originally dreamed of building a community, a city of the future. Yeah. That was his first design for Epcot. I always thought that was such a fascinating idea. Do you think it could have worked?
It needed the dream at the center. You can't just have a community. You have to have some central thing that holds the whole thing together. And so I think Epcot holds the community together, and they're building things around the edge now. Eventually, all of Walt's dream will be complete.
Does it make sense to you, looking back at Walt's career, that this man who started with animated drawings should become an urban designer?
That's a great thing. I'm glad you asked that because he built Disneyland, because it was full of things we didn't need but really needed. We don't need a lot of trees, you plant them. We don't need a lot of benches, you put them down. You don't need a lot of flowers, you plant them. That's French. That's out of Paris, the environment of Paris that Walt learned and grew up with. So he built Disneyland as an example, a way of living, not just an entertainment center. You can go there and sit on a bench and people watch because it's a happy experience. Why? The flowers, the trees, the fountains, all over and above all the other elements. So he was teaching us urban planning, though he didn't intend to do it. I took some architects out to Disneyland, and I took them to meet John Hench 35 years ago. And I worked on a mall myself, but was influenced by what I saw at Disneyland. This goes way back to a time when he was still alive, huh? But I took all my architectural friends there, and I introduced them. I said, you can learn from Disney and from Disneyland. And they went out then, people like John Jardy, and built malls all over the world. His influence has changed the entire world, not just part of America.
The mundane but nice idea of an amusement park, and did something different with it. He built an environment, and no one had done that before, had they?
That's right, yes.
What I love about walking into Disneyland still to this day is that you're in a place. You're in a place that's not like any other place on Earth.
Well, we all want to build a time machine, don't we? We all envy we like certain stories, like H.G. Wells' Time Machine. So when you enter Disneyland, you're entering a time machine, and you can take various avenues. But the main drag is my grandmother's time. Just a few years before I was born, I could walk down that street in Waukegan, and there it was. But perfect, perfect. And then you take a turn over here, and you're in wilderness country. And then you take another turn, you're in jungle country, where you wanted to be when you were 10 with Tarzan. And then you take another turn, and you're in the future. So the whole thing is one fabulous time machine with a series of doors you can open and go into the past or the future.
And yet, it also is very indicative and reflective of that one man, Walt Disney, because that Main Street, for instance, is his idealized Main Street, having grown up in the Midwest. And somebody building a similar park today might not have those feelings at all for that kind of a centerpiece. But it meant an awful lot to Walt, didn't it?
Well, he was an unusual man. Walt was a dramatist of the human condition. I've been writing a short story recently about a time machine, an ordinary time machine. You get it and you go back in time in order to get a glass of lemonade from your daughter out on the sidewalk on a hot summer when she was 10. And that's this thing here that Walt can do for you. You want to go back and have a drink of lemonade on a day that's been lost for a long time, he'll do it for you.
Do you have a favorite ride or attraction at Disneyland?
Oh, I have a number. I love the Pirates of the Caribbean. I was there when they were digging the hole and walked through before they put the water in. And the haunted house, too. I walked through and tried to give them some ideas. I felt privileged to be there and walk around with John Hench and with Walt on occasion. But it's terrific, terrific.
What do you think the world lost when Walt died? And he died so young.
They didn't lose anything. His personality, his memory is so strong that the world goes on changing. We've got the Grove Mall that opened here at 3rd and Fairfax recently. That's pure Disney. It's built by all the people that he influenced when he was alive. People are always saying to me, do you believe in immortality? I said, yes, I do. I said, I have 4 daughters and 8 grandchildren and my books. I'm immortal. Maybe for only 40 years, but Walt is immortal for the next 100 years.
What's the quality you admired most in Walt Disney?
The quality I admired most was if he knew you cared, if he knew you were as enthused as he was, then he spent time with you. He must have recognized that in me that day when he saw me shopping at Christmas, a kindred spirit. So it's that ability to know when someone's really listening. You don't want to wander around a shop and pretend to care about what you're seeing, because the Disney studio is a Renaissance shop. The Renaissance is not dead, it's still alive. All these crafts and arts are still alive because of that enthusiasm.
Ray, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and your memories and your ideas and your great spirit with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.